to tell us about the research that Joseph Rowntree is carrying out. Peter joined the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as head of evidence in July 2019. His team oversees a massive amount of JRF evidence it has on poverty, and they provide a knowledge base which underpins the JRF's outcome plans and its impact on the real world. Before joining JRF, Peter worked for almost 20 years in the civil service, including on the government's annual poverty statistics, poverty analysis at DWP, and on fuel poverty and energy price analysis. And in fact, I remember working with Peter and the key role he played in the early days of the UK government's fuel poverty strategy. So I'll hand over to you, Peter. Thank you very much for speaking.
William, if everybody just wait for a moment, I'm going to get my slides on screen if that's okay. Excellent. William, are you able to confirm that you can hear me and see the slides?
Yes, that's fine.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. So I'll kick off. Thanks, everybody. So yes, I was working on fuel poverty analysis from 2004 to 2007, and unfortunately that was another period when fuel prices were rising and levels of fuel poverty mentioned on the definition used then doubled in a couple of years. So unfortunately it feels very, very sort of sense of deja vu at the current time. But I'm going to mainly talk about poverty trends because obviously that's where I'm working at the moment. There the slides aren't going to move. Do you see the slides moving? I'm hoping you do.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yes,
excellent. Excellent. So basically, this year we've done a new UK poverty report, which we're aiming that will achieve all of the things on this slide. So having an overview of all the aspects of poverty, making analysis available, looking beyond just the main poverty statistics at a wider range of data sources, hearing the voices of lived experience, looking to identify key drivers, making a judgment on progress, and being consistent over time so we can look at trends and monitor what's going on. So what are the levels at the moment? And so I'm going to go through very quickly a few slides about what are kind of poverty levels amongst different groups. So I'm starting off with the poverty pre-pandemic, with 22 in every 100 people being in poverty. This rises to 27 in every 100 people where someone's with families containing a disabled person being in poverty. And that rises further to 31 in every 100 children in poverty. 47 in every children in a family with 3 or more children were in poverty. And then almost half of households headed by someone of Pakistani ethnicity were in poverty. And then over half of people in households headed with someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity were in poverty. And the definition of poverty we're using here is the usual international definition of relative poverty. So it's poverty relative to the median. And what we can see is basically some of the key drivers, disability, family size and stuff like that, and also some of the interactions with policy as well. So we see sort of in the UK we've got a benefits only being paid out for the first 2 children, so that's one of the reasons why poverty for families with 3 or more children is very high as well. And I presented these similar slides about a year ago, and the main thing I've had to do since then is actually colour in some more of the kind of icons red, which is very worrying. And these are data for 2019-20. So the new data comes out actually on Thursday. So unfortunately, this presentation is going to be out of date in a few days' time, but that's what's happening pre-pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit later on in the presentation about what the pandemic might have done to these statistics. So what's happened over time? So basically, the lines that I'd point you to are the top and the bottom line. So the top line is children, and we can see from around 2000 and probably definitely from around 2013, there's been an upward trend. And for pensioners, again, an upward trend since about 2012-13. So these we find are really worrying. And what we think is happening here is basically 2 effects trying to almost cancel out each other. So there's been a positive labour market, that's been sort of pulling poverty downwards, but then benefit freezes and other benefit cuts which have been pushing poverty upwards. And so we see working age families without children sort of going down in terms of poverty rates. That's because basically the work part of the equation is beating the benefit part of the equation, but children and pensioners are more reliant on benefits sort of to supplement their incomes, and that's why we think in recent years children and pensioners have fared worse in terms of poverty trends. There's also different poverty levels as there are fuel poverty levels across the country. So the highest rates are in London, where we think that's the tenure mix and high housing costs that are a significant driver. Other rates are high in, the same rates are high in North East, West Midlands and Yorkshire and Humber. Here we think it's a different cause. We think it's higher levels of worklessness and adults in lower paid routine occupations, so not having a high wage. And you can see the lowest rates are in Northern Ireland and Scotland. And what do we think of the drivers? So we think part of it is due to expensive housing, part of it's due to low paid insecure work, part of it's due to inadequate social security and financial support. But one of the key sort of pressures that is increasing over time and that we're really worried about is the cost of living pressures. So that's what I'm going to talk about for quite a lot of the remaining of the slides. But just to cover off housing and social security and work. So basically, the issue of housing, which is obviously very, very related to fuel poverty, we think the poverty story is a bit about the number of private renters. So we've got the number of private renters has doubled in number, and we know that private renting is an insecure and expensive form of tenure. So there's a third of private renters are in poverty. So you might recall the first slide, that's much higher than a quarter of the whole population being in poverty. And we can also see basically a very, very small fraction of the social housing that's needed to be built was being built pre-pandemic, and that's unlikely to have changed since then. And we also worry about private renting because it's such an insecure tenure. And also, I suppose, from a fuel poverty perspective, it's also quite hard to make sure that the housing stock is energy efficient as well. So that's the very, very brief story on housing, where we think that it's partly about lack of affordability, partly about lack of social housing, and partly about almost like a too big private rented sector because of inaffordability of owning a house and unavailability of social housing. On benefit levels, so basically we see over the periods of a 1% uprating since 2013-14, and then a benefits freeze when inflation was obviously going up post-Brexit, particularly towards the end of this chart, an erosion of the benefit values of about 8% in just a decade. And since then, benefits have been uprated with inflation, but of course, the inflation rate that they're being used to uprate next month is the inflation rate of September, and September predates most of the big increases in inflation. So basically those people on benefits won't see an inflation related and the spiking inflation related increase in their benefits until April 2023 at the earliest. And then, as William says, there's a second potential spike in energy prices in October, which is a month too late to be factored into the uprating for next year. So some of the effects of energy price rises won't actually be felt in the benefits rates until April 2024. And basically, hearing from people who've lived experience of living on a low income, we find that a lot of families are really struggling and getting into debt. Times are hard, food is expensive now, and the cost of everything is going up. And obviously, unfortunately, seeing the OBR report from last week, that's set to continue and get worse in the coming months. So I want to just talk specifically about energy prices and the rising cost of living on low-income households. But I wanted to start by just thinking about what's the preceding period when, during the pandemic, when inflation was pretty low, but what was the kind of financial impacts of the pandemic. And so this is on the vertical axis, the proportion of households struggling with their financial situation. And basically you see actually a fairly flat picture over the whole of the over the first year of the pandemic from May to 2020 till March 2021. But you do see the profile you'd expect. Basically, the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% of incomes are struggling a lot more than the top 20% of incomes. And basically, before the cost of living rise and so forth, we've consistently seen almost half of the bottom income quintile reporting they're struggling with their financial situation even before prices have started to rise. And basically, we also saw a massive increase in the debt of people. So the percentage of low-income households in arrears was 11% pre-pandemic, and then sort of, I think optimistically post-pandemic, but in September and October 2021, it had gone up to 3.8 million, so trebling in about a year and a half, which is really worrying. And there is kind of key kind of demographic profiles for who's got that kind of debt, so, and who's in arrears. So it's, and some of these statistics are pretty scary. So this is of low income households on the chart. So 7 in 10 low income households headed by someone of 18 to 24-year-olds were in arrears. Almost 70% of universal credit recipients, low income universal credit recipients, were in debt. And then clear kind of differences by families with children and larger families and non-white ethnicity households. But you can see basically we're talking about a third of all low-income households being in arrears before sort of the rise in cost of living. So there won't be, things that they, they'll already be feeling the pinch already. So what are the types of arrears? So basically, we see 10% of low-income households are in arrears of their water bills, 1.2 million households. And what we also see is that you probably won't be able to read it on your screen, but the fifth bar from the left is electricity and gas. So basically, we have 12% of low-income households in arrears with their energy and gas, according to this survey that we conducted, and that's 1.4 million households. So again, really worrying situation before the start of the rise in cost of living. And there's also basically overlap. So as you'd expect, if you're in arrears with one type of bill, you're more likely to be in arrears than other types of bill. So one of the big overlaps is between council tax arrears and energy arrears, with almost half being in both. And I'm afraid this is a bit of a depressing presentation, but basically there's deeply concerning prospects. So the chart on the left shows after tax wages, and basically a big fall between 2021-22 and 23-24 before a kind of gradual recovery. But even in the end of the OBR's forecast period, it's still 1 percentage points below where it was at the moment. And basically we think that the impact on the spring statement on working age households was negative and regressive. So the failure to do to actually match benefits with the actual massive increase in inflation has sort of dragged down benefit levels for particularly people on the lowest incomes. And where does this matter? Well, basically those on lower incomes spend more of their income on essentials. So the purple bars at the bottom of this chart are housing, water, electricity, and food and non-alcoholic drinks. And basically you can see that that's a bigger proportion of poorer households sort of incomes. And this is about energy. So basically what we've done here is plugged in the calculations of the energy cap for different years. So basically we for low income households, so these are households in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, and you can see the massive jump between 2019-20 and 2022-23 caused by the energy price increases. And you can also see that it remains high in 23-24 as well. And some of these are just unsustainably large. So we've got a single adult on low income spending a shocking 50% of their incomes on energy, which was previously the third, which is still massively more than the 10% that's often quoted, but half is just how would somebody cope with that? So I'll really rapidly, because I know I'm running out of time, focus on some of the areas that we think we should sort of have action on. So it will correspond to the areas I showed you about things that are sort of putting people under pressure. So we think there is a bit about making sure that people, that the people aren't sort of dragged down by the debt that were accrued during the pandemic. We do think that social security needs to be strengthened beyond the operating, but to make sure some of its, some of the payments are keeping up with inflation. We sort of welcomed, but it seemed very sort of not sufficient, the support from the Chancellor. So the council tax rebate was very widely kind of spread across the population, so it wasn't very targeted. And the energy rebate is kind of a loan and a clawback, so it almost assumes that energy prices will fall in subsequent years. And then we think also quite a lot of the actual the issues being tackled are through kind of area based and things, pots that you have to apply for, like the household support fund. And we think that that's just a bit kind of arbitrary. You need to know the funds available, you need to go through lots of hoops to get to it. And we think access and consistency is more important, and hence calling for the benefit system to be the way to do it. We need better jobs. One of the things the government promised a long time ago was an employment bill, to make sure work is secure, flexible, and has good enforcement and paying rights. And all the kind of experience of the P&O ferry staff, shows that we do think there needs to be some strengthening in this area. And finally, I think we do need to build decent, affordable homes that are also energy efficient, and that would be a solution to some of the kind of poverty problems, but would also be a solution for some of the fuel poverty problems as well. Thanks everybody, and yeah, looking forward to all the presentations and hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, can I just apologise for all those doorbell sounds at the beginning of the session? Technical issues, I'm told, is a problem, but hopefully you shouldn't hear them now. Any questions for clarification for Peter? We will have a proper question and answer, but if there's anything people weren't quite sure about, please let me know. I mean, Peter, just one thing that occurred to me, I wondered if you could give some thought to is, what do you see as the balance between policies that focus on income and those that focus on energy?
Yes, so I suppose, like many things, I would say you need both. I suppose and I also think it's sort of the immediate crisis versus kind of the long term as well. So if you've got a bill landing on your doorstep that you can't afford to pay, then support for the benefit system or immediate kind of cash payments is probably the only thing that can get you through that crisis situation. Whereas we know for fuel poverty and for kind of environmental reasons, to actually make the bill lower through energy efficiency is also important. So I think it is both. I suppose from because obviously I'm on the poverty side, I think sort of the immediate support is needed quickly as things get, well, potentially getting worse. That's sort of where, but I do think it is both. Yeah,
and yeah, just perhaps it's a question about the consequences of debt and so on. I suspect this might be coming from somebody who lives outside the UK, because I was asked about results in disconnections. I mean, without preempting you, I suppose the straightforward response would be generally what happens is people have a prepayment meter installed, and in effect they disconnect themselves if they can't afford to pay the bill. But I mean, what other consequences do you see about debt? And I mean, to what extent would you acknowledge your experience of it being multiple debt?
Yeah, so as I say, there's loads and loads of overlapping debts because and particularly from people with lived experience, you hear sort of almost having to work out, well, which one of those arrears am I paying off that's most likely to sort of result in kind of court cases or sort of bailiffs and things like that. So it's really kind of terrifying kind of choices, and I just think it's the kind of stress of it all. I think that's something that's sort of not properly realized when you're sort of living under that pressure and scared of the person coming along just because you don't know what's going to be in their bag. I think that's the kind of experience of it, and it's just very hard to get out of that situation when your income is insufficient.
Yeah, certainly I understand from a lot of people working in the advice world, they're just we're hearing a lot about people just too scared to put on their heating and so on. I think we have a question from Brenda.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Can you bring us up to date in the privately rented sector? I've heard anecdotally that an awful lot of private landlords are getting out of the privately rented sector because of recent government policy. First of all, the way they changed tax allowances for landlords, and secondly, the minimum standards that they've brought in, and that large numbers of privately rented properties are now going over to Airbnb or second homes. And so therefore, what was an increasing sector is about to decrease. Goodness knows what the effect will be.
It's interesting. So I think we've seen some of that, but we've also seen that some of yeah, certainly it hasn't actually turned in the latest data, but yeah, I think it is worrying that. So I think one of the things we've been sort of calling for is a kind of better and maybe a smaller private rented sector. But one of the kind of key questions is, well, where do those people actually, go to? We want to make sure that they we have a decent sort of social security and social sector 10 years. So I think it's something to be wary of. I think the market isn't working, so something has to change. But sort of making sure it gets better rather than worse.
Sorry, I missed that last bit. It's something to be what?
So I think it's something that we just need to keep monitoring.
Yeah, I think it's happening, and I don't know where people are going.
Okay, well, we can come back to some of these issues later, but can I thank you very much, Peter. As I say, I think it's really important that, when we talk about fuel poverty, we don't forget about the poverty side of things, and, and it's that which is causing particular alarm amongst fuel poverty campaigners at the moment. If I can now hand over to Dr. Anne Owens, who is a University Academic Fellow in the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds. And her work focuses on the environmental impacts associated with household consumption. And she produces the UK's annual consumption-based emissions account for the UK government. Some of the recent projects have focused on the distributional impacts of climate policy on UK households, which is an issue very close to FPRN's heart. Identifying the ways in which type of households might be disproportionately affected if there are changes in the way that carbon policies, environmental policies are funded. So over to you, Anne.
Thanks very much. Okay, great. So here are my slides. So I'm going to talk to you about fair recovery of carbon policy costs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you first of all about how the UK currently funds its climate policy, and then talk about alternative methods that my team and I think might produce a fairer way of paying for these costs, and then just leave you with some conclusions and reading, etc. So next slide, please. Tackling climate change and achieving net zero requires a complete transformation of the energy systems, and obviously this costs money. Currently, the way the government funds this is to recover the cost by applying a levy or basically a tax on household and business electricity and gas bills. Now, for this presentation, and most of my work is focused on households. So for the householder, this is around 13% of your energy bill goes towards funding climate policy. And my next slide will show you what these costs go towards. So next slide, please. So you can see that the majority of the levy goes towards paying for renewable energy. A small fraction of the costs actually go back to households. So you can see here we've got the ECO, the energy company obligation, and basically these costs, which are recovered from the household bill, are sort of directed back to low-income households in terms of helping to improve the energy efficiency of the home. So we do see that households are getting some of these policy costs back, but is this more or less than the amount they were putting in to start with? And it's actually, pretty debatable as to whether low-income homes are actually self-funding the improvements that they can then get the money back for. The costs which are recovered, which go back to low-income homes, only account for 17% of the total. in overall. So next slide, please. So without these improved energy efficiency measures, our bills would actually be nearly £500 larger. But there's a question as to whether fuel poor households have actually benefited equally. There's a lot of households living in fuel poverty who don't qualify for support from the eco grants. And David Weatherall, who I think was head of policy at the Energy Saving Trust when I first wrote this article that this presentation is based on, he says that eco is only a cost on their bills, and the risk of fuel poverty actually becomes more pronounced because they're then having to pay for it themselves. So next slide, please. Our argument is that by focusing just on the energy used for heating and powering the home, you're actually missing quite a lot of the story as to what energy is used by households. It's very easy to think of the energy needs of households as just being the stuff that, you know, when you turn the lights on in your home, or you're cooking, or you're heating your home. But actually, if you look at the energy system as a whole, everything that we use and buy has required energy somewhere in the supply chain. So actually, the proportion of energy used by households for heating and powering the home is only around 25% of the whole. There's a lot of energy used in transportation, there's energy used to make the food that we eat, energy used in the products and services that we consume. And by placing all of the policy recovery costs on just the fraction of energy that's used to heat and power the home, this might disproportionately disadvantage households where that is a large portion of their bill. And you saw in the slides previously presented that for low-income households, these necessities, heating and powering the home, represents a much larger portion of their total expenditure than everywhere else. So thanks for showing that slide. That's really helped me with my presentation. So what we're trying to argue is that if you place the policy costs just on this small fraction of the household's bill, are you missing something? And is it unfair on low-income households? So next slide, please. Because spending on gas and electricity represents a greater portion of low-income households' income than higher-income households, the portion of income paid towards these policy costs is a lot higher for a low-income home. Now, the chart on the left-hand side shows just how drastic this is. I've split every household in the UK up into 5% income groups. And you can see that the lowest income group, the lowest 5%, the portion that they pay towards policy costs is just over 1% of their household income. Whereas if you look at the highest income, this is, you know, barely 0.02% of their total income. So it really ramps up as you sort of move through the income groups. We don't have to split households up by income. We can also look at other demographic factors. And we find that homes in the rural northeast, homes where there are single female pensioners, homes where there are people that are long-term unemployed, these are the types of households which are contributing disproportionately more towards energy policy. On the flip side, households where you've got 2 adults earning money with no kids, these are the ones that are paying disproportionately less, and also those in kind of managerial occupations. Next slide, please. So when designing a tax for funding these policies, there are a number of concerns that need to be addressed and decisions that need to be made. It shouldn't be regressive. So what we're seeing a regressive tax where the lowest incomes are paying disproportionately more, they're paying a higher proportion. Can we design a policy where it's not a regressive tax. And one of the things we could do is not just focus on direct energy use, so just the energy that's used to heat and power the home. What about if we took the full spectrum of energy use of households? Finally, is there an even better measure than that? Is there another policy mechanism which might bring about a fairer way of funding these? Next slide, please. So in this piece of work that I'm presenting to you, and again, I'd just like to say this was done pre-pandemic as well, so some of the numbers are probably not as severe as they are now. We looked in detail at 3 ways in which energy policy could be funded. So the first is the sort of business as usual, where households are paying a percentage on their energy and on their energy bills. The second we called the household energy footprint approach. So in this, rather than just focusing on the energy bills, we took that full spectrum of spend. So we looked not only at energy used in the home, we looked at mobility, we looked at shopping, we looked at services, we looked at food. And the final approach we thought was, what happens if, rather than paying for policy costs through a tax on spending, what if it was done on income? So if it was just added to basic income tax, what difference would this make to costs paid by different types of household? Next slide, please. So in order to calculate what this tax would look like if it was on the full spectrum of the energy requirements of households, we need to calculate something known as the energy footprint. I'm not going to explain how this is done, but basically part of the work I do for UK government in the consumption-based accounting means that I have a model which allows us to look at the full supply chain energy implications of everything that households consume in 1 year. And you can see that the big hitters are the bars in green, so the energy associated with mobility, and domestic gas and energy has obviously got quite a large impact. Shelter, which is basically building and maintaining your home, and food are the main big sectors. And the really interesting thing here, and the take-home message from this chart, is look at the way the red bar increases as you go up the income groups. It really doesn't. So that's the energy used to heat and power your home as households get richer. The energy footprint is driven by mobility. It's basically driven by private transport, train travel, and air travel. So this is the thing that's really ramps up when households get richer. If you only tax based on energy used to heat and power the home, you're not capturing that full spectrum of difference in the energy requirements of households. So higher income homes use nearly twice the domestic energy and electricity of the lowest income, but their actual energy requirements are 5 times. So in reality, what they should be paying is 5 times the policy costs, because we're ignoring the energy that's needed in other areas of their lifestyles in terms of their mobility. So what we're doing, what we suggested for this option 2 was to take the money required to fund the energy policy and distribute it according to this pattern, rather than just the energy used in the home. Next slide, please. So what happens to different income groups? What this chart here shows is what the difference in their bill would be if we took this approach. And you can see that there are reductions in the bill for low income groups and increases in these higher income groups. So the lowest income households would see their contribution fall from £114 to 86, And the highest incomes would increase their payments from around 200 to nearly 300. Next slide, please. So the final option that we looked at was then just placing it on income tax payments. And again, we see reductions for the lowest income groups and increases for the highest income groups. But here the numbers are actually sort of stretched a bit. It's not obvious because the scale on the graph is slightly different, but you can see that the highest income groups are now contributing £656 per year. So this one is the one which hits those high income groups the highest. In my final slides on the results, I compare the proportion of your income that each of these options suggests. And you can see we have number one, the red dots is our current way of doing things, which is the regressive policy. It's got a negative gradient to those dots. The polluter pays one is fairly kind of, it is regressive because lower income groups are still paying a higher contribution of their income, but it's not as regressive. And the general taxation one is the only one of these which is actually a progressive policy, where we see a higher proportion of income payments the more income a household earns. So just to leave you with a few more conclusions, it's important that the burden of responsibility is not placed on households that struggle to meet their basic needs. We argue that the current system is inequitable. It's clear that we need a new approach, which is practical and simple. As much fun as calculating the energy footprint of every house is, that's actually not a particularly practical way of regrouping these costs. There is not a mechanism for going around and finding out what the energy footprint of every single household is. So we would argue that actually placing the policy costs on income tax is a mechanism that already exists and works and would be a lot fairer than the current solution. Final slide, please. So there is a paper on this. I think it's open access, so it will be free for everybody to read. And there's a few more publications which I've done with the Grantham Institute on a similar theme, looking at distributional impacts of carbon taxes in the UK. Any questions, please?
Thank you, Anne. Really interesting. And I think, yes, you're very right to make it clear that a levy is a tax. And I think this seemed to be, government saw this as a, as a way of perhaps hiding policy costs by paying for them through levy mechanisms. And yeah, very much, I think your focus on the fact that it's the high income groups that are basically emitting by far the most carbon and therefore contributing by far more to climate change than lower income groups is very opposite. Perhaps later we might sort of have a discussion about moving policy costs to taxation. Certainly, a number of us have been calling for that as a way of trying, as one contribution to reducing bills, although obviously it's still the contribution would be modest. I think we've got one or two questions for clarification. Shall I, Ian from Centre for Sustainable Energy, have you quick question, please?
Oh, I suppose, yeah, it was perhaps not necessarily a question, but I think when we looked at it in the past, we also tried to look at what the future policy costs are, because what we've got at the moment isn't really enough to tackle the issue in terms of the policy. Like, we've got some environment, some energy policies, but we need to sort of double them, treble them to get where we need to. So will you be looking in the future at, because I think when we've looked at it in the past, we I think concluded that you needed to use bills and taxation. because once you like increase the amount we're trying to get 3 or 4-fold, you know, you can't move it around. It's got to go everywhere. So I think that was my question.
Yeah, I've just done some work again with Grantham on greenhouse gas removal technologies as well. So this is another way in which households might end up having to pay more for their products depending on how they're funded. And initial findings for that is it might add another £400 on average to household bills, depending on the mechanism we use. So yeah, yeah, it is really important. It's an important area to look at, and I agree it probably needs to be a combination of money on bills and some other way of taxing.
Thank you, Anne. And a quick question from Sana, please.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. That was a brilliant presentation, very interesting. Sorry, can I not go a video because I'm in a really awkward location? So apologies for that. Yeah, I'm from Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and I was just wondering because my understanding is that a lot of the levies that are attached to our energy bills are almost exclusively attached to the electricity bill rather than gas bill, and it's by far not covering the cost of all climate policy, including energy policy. It's mostly just some of the cost of contracts for difference. I was just interested in whether you've done some analysis on the impact of these levies, in particular on the lowest income households who have electricity only. Because I looked at some figures, sort of very just glancing at them, and it seems that there are about 700,000 households in the UK who have electricity only, which is the cleanest heating and household utility mechanism. But 25% of those households live in fuel poverty because electricity cost is so much higher than gas. So I was just wondering if that's something that you're looking at in your research.
I haven't done it yet, but it's something I want to do, is to break down energy into the two different types. And you're right in that it's actually costing more for electricity, because if you've got, you know, your storage heaters and that kind of thing, it can cost more to heat the home. And then it doesn't seem fair that electricity is looking to be a much greener way of heating, and we are going to switch, hopefully, you know, that switch to heating through electricity would be a better option if we can produce our electricity more greenly. So no, I think that's something we need to look at next, and to create profiles of the types of houses that are predominantly electricity users. So I think that could be something to look at soon.
Yeah, it's an important, Sana, there is, the government was at one point talking about, you know, this difference between the policy costs that are added to gas and those that are added to electricity, because obviously it is much higher electricity. And there was a concern that that they were talking about moving to a more equal balance between the two, so essentially moving those policy costs off electricity into gas. And I think a lot of people, well, when we see what's happening with gas prices now, I think that would be a pretty disastrous approach. And so that's why many of us have been calling, saying, no, that's not, you know, it'd be far more progressive to move those policy costs from electricity to general taxation. And, you know, but obviously one of the concerns that some making that is we are seeing this sort of backlash against net zero policies, and you know, some are now sort of are saying that this is the cause of the problems, and perhaps this is a debate we can come to later. Sorry, there was just one question in terms of, you know, you gave some very useful figures about the impact of policy costs in different types of households. Were you able to look at sort of any intersectional issues about how, you know, people, you know, let's say lone parents or with disabilities or whatever, that combination might affect them?
Yeah, I showed you the income because it's easiest, but yeah, we did look at within those groups, within the income groups, what were they made up of? So what proportion of the income group were single parents? What proportion were, you know, what job types do we see within it? And I mean, basically, it's just using the living cost and food survey to find out who was in each income group and see which members had their bills increasing and which didn't. So I can share, that's all in the paper.
Thank you. And Ian from Centre for Sustainable Energy has just drawn attention to some research that I know I was involved with back in 2013, which looked specifically at some of the issues that were mentioned about electricity consumers and you know, the fact they tend to be at the moment more likely to be on lower incomes, and yet, you know, benefit least from carbon policies, but pay some of the highest costs. I think we better move on to the next speaker. We've got Sabrina from European Anti-Poverty Network, which is a network of national, regional and local organisations active in the fight against poverty and social exclusion. She supports people experiencing poverty and energy poverty in their demand for a socially fair green transition which combines social and environmental targets. And prior to this, she worked in the field of social rights and external relations in the Euro-Mediterranean region. So I think it's going to be really useful to hear about you know, what's happening on mainland Europe. Perhaps we're still part of Europe, even if we're not part of the European Union. And you know, because obviously this is an issue just as that's affecting many people across Europe as well as in the UK. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you, William and Fuel Poverty Research Network for inviting us on this occasion. And yes, I can already confirm that there are a lot of common trends and overlaps between the UK and Europe. To date, we are facing a very hard reality. Rising energy costs across Europe are jeopardizing universal access to affordable energy services. Although energy has been recognized at EU level as one of the essential services under the framework of the European Pillar of Social Rights. The situation we are in is especially true for people living in poverty, who are often left to make unacceptable choices between, for example, the food, health expenses, rent, gas, and electricity. To date, more than 50 million people across the EU are experiencing energy poverty and cannot sufficiently light, heat or cool their homes, with inadequate housing linked to 100,000 premature deaths annually. And almost 80 million people in the EU already before the pandemic, so in 2019, were late or unable to pay their utility bills. As you know, the COVID pandemic and then the recent explosion in energy prices have exacerbated the situation for multiple interconnected reasons. If I need to list the main reasons, I would say that the first would be that the worst performing homes have largely missed out on renovation, and unfortunately these are mostly occupied by low-income households. Low-income households are highly dependent on fossil fuel, particularly the gas, for the energy consumption at home, and they also risk of getting locked in the fossil fuel infrastructure in the next decade to come if Europe does not speed up the socially just clean energy transition. Europe also is still highly dependent on fossil gas, also for electricity. And this has created a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable, as electricity is the highest share of expenditure out of the disposable income. And I would also highlight that low-income households have limited access to renewable and energy efficiency program, as they cannot pay upfront, or the access to finance is very complex for them. In this framework, we do have some trends or some challenges that are very important, specifically in the context of the energy crisis. We do observe that the EU wholesale electricity market and the energy taxation directive as well in the last few years have favored fossil fuel over renewables. There is a huge need for the optimization of the design of the electricity market and the pricing mechanism. So at your level, the pricing mechanism is still determined by marginal pricing, which is often linked to gas. So when gas becomes more expensive, actually also the final electricity prices soar in periods of high demand, like the period in which we are at the moment. In general, we do see that market or only market-led solutions and the current neoliberal model is not well equipped to bring about a radical change needed to decarbonize our economies, because it doesn't leave too much freedom or too much room for maneuver actually to member state for systematic price control. In addition to this challenge, another challenge in continental Europe between the Western and Eastern European countries is that there is not a harmonized vision about what is to be considered as a transition fuel towards a green economy. For some countries, gas, for example, has been considered as a transition fuel. For some other countries, the nuclear energy is a transition fuel. And other countries, specifically the Eastern European countries, are still dependent on coal-fired power stations. So this creates a very diversified picture at your level. And also the evidence brings out the evidence that a one-size-fits-all solution probably will not solve the problem. I would like to share with you as well, just to give you a hint of the differences across Europe, some of the data that our national members share with us, which will illustrate also the common challenges that I just highlighted. For example, Iceland. In Iceland, the supply of energy has been recently privatized. So they are already experiencing higher prices and clearly solutions that are not addressing rising energy prices. But the production is still local. So this model, which was recently implemented, seems not to be working. In Portugal, for example, almost 75% of houses do not have sustainable energy use. And this condition not only actually worsen the life of people already in energy poverty, but also middle-class people who have seen their incomes decrease. Greece is also another good example. Greece has the most expensive energy prices, especially for gas and electricity, from almost all European countries. And the effect of these increases in energy on the consumer are quite strong, specifically in the context of very low wages. Recently, the poorest group in Greece actually have tried to replace the heating system at home with any fuel that is cheaper, even if polluting and unsafe. And this has resulted in a large number of accidents of domestic fires, which is a new growing phenomenon in the country. Until recently, most of the electricity in Greece, but not all in Greece, so Greece can be considered as an illustrative case in Europe, was generated from polluting lignite, which is still used in large power plants. And only very recently, the Greek government announced a very ambitious short-term plan to switch to cleaner forms of electricity generation, but with no other social safeguard and social measure to avoid the impact on the most vulnerable. So this has created actually quite immediately intense insecurity in terms of high poverty rate, in terms of low incomes, and even higher unemployment. In this situation in which we are, actually, what we believe in FPRN, but also in other European networks with whom we work, is that the immediate emergency support is still crucial to overcome the crisis, but for sure this will not tackle structural inequalities. So we do see the importance of implementing a mix of short and long-term measures. So amongst the short-term measures, the ban on disconnection from the energy grid and social tariff should be maintained. But as said, we really advocate for truly structural investment and reforms to make the right to clean and affordable energy accessible to all. I will not have time to give you a full picture of the whole possible type of investment and reforms, but I will mention some. For example, the fully subsidized deep renovation programs to stop indecent housing, targeted investment in renewables and energy efficiency programs for vulnerable groups, phasing out dependence on fossil fuel by regulating, for example, by regulating the sale of fossil fuel boilers, stopping the subsidies to fossil fuel, and applying the polluter pays principle, but in a socially just way, as we know that low-income households could be in practice considered as polluters. So the carbon pricing imposed on all is less fair than other approaches like a general tax approach or regulatory approach. In this respect, we need to pay attention to adopt measure and not to transform low-income consumers depending on gas at the moment in the polluter, as they are the least responsible for the climate change and for the failing energy system in which we are at the moment. Then we also advocate for strong social safeguard and financial incentives in the context of the Fit for 55 package, which is the delivering the Green Deal at EU level and the renovation wave strategy for specific target groups. As said, we do see a very urgent need to optimize the electricity market design and putting the energy system under democratic governance and public control. And last but not least in the list that I would like to share with you is very much in line with previous speaker, the implementation of a progressive green tax system, which could shift tax from labor to high income, corporate income, which could leverage energy tax revenue to support the energy poor people, for example, and could ideally reduce labor taxation on low-income earners. Of course, this measure alone, none of these measures alone will work. So we need to design a comprehensive package. And also when we talk about the environmental taxation and the progressive green tax reforms, I think it's also crucial to point out that this should be contextualized in a more adequate social protection system, as Peter said. So better social safety net, adequate minimum wages, good working conditions, and adequate salaries across amongst the priorities. Sorry. I will stop here and remain available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Can I just use Chair's privilege to ask you a quick question? As I mentioned, there has been a backlash in the UK against the sort of net zero policies, and they've been, singled out as, a major contributor to the gas price crisis. Are you seeing that similar? Is that happening in other European countries and within the EU? Are you seeing a similar sort of backlash, political movement in that direction?
Ask you to repeat the question because I've lost the internet for a few seconds.
I was just saying, Sabrina, that in the UK we've seen a backlash against net zero policies, that they've been seen as a major contributor to escalating prices of fuel, and whether you've seen a similar trend in Europe, across Europe, or in the EU, European institutions.
Yes and no. It depends on the country. So in some of the Eastern European countries, we have seen a narrative of since we need to achieve the climate target, this is actually putting more pressure on energy poverty and on decreases of the energy prices. But at EU level, the Commission is trying to of course, demonstrate that this is not the case, because we still believe that actually the access to not only affordable but clean energy is essential for all. As said, most of the low-income people risk of getting locked in a fossil fuel, so the only way for them not to pay the carbon pricing one day will actually be to access more diversified energy sources. So at EU level, I could say that the Commission is trying to design or advocate for a socially just green transition, which combine the social target and the environmental target. And across the countries, is also true that in some countries, this narrative, populist narrative, is very widespread. So I will not make the name of the countries, but some of the countries, yes, do use this narrative and try to, in a way, find an easy culprit for the energy prices. But the Greek example also shows that it's important, although we all believe in the importance of decarbonization of the economy and of the energy, it's also important to keep an eye on the short-term impact on low-income people.
Thanks, Sabrina. So we've come to the section of the webinar where we can have more discussion and some questions and answers. I know some started coming through the chat, and I noticed Brenta's hand. So I just, first one was, in these sort of crisis moments, as I think I mentioned, this is probably one of the biggest single crisis in fuel prices we've seen for several decades. But who do speakers think best placed to support people to pay their energy bills and to help them afford energy or get out of debt? Who would you signpost people to? Shall we start with Peter?
Yeah, no problem. So I think Citizens Advice Bureau would be one of the obvious people from my perspective. I think one of the things that I am conscious of, though, is the kind of resourcing of these organisations. But I do think that they're well placed to sort of look across the piece. But I think then sort of how much can they cope with a massive influx of people who will have these really difficult situations. So that would be my sort of starter.
Thank you. And Dan?
Not really my area of expertise, but I would say we need to try and reduce need for energy, both from that will reduce your bill and it will help emissions. So helping households access those grants they can get to fully insulate their loft and that sort of thing can make a huge difference. I mean, if you insulate your loft, it can reduce your heating bills by sometimes even up to a quarter. So helping households realize which grants are available to them, I think, is a really important thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
and Sabrina?
Can you hear me well?
Yes. Fine,
Okay,
fine.
I'm having some Wi-Fi issues. So yeah, a lot of things could be done depending also on the interaction between the national, I would say regional and municipal level. Two things that came to my mind are the one-stop shops, which seems to be working or promising practices in some of the regions in Europe. And it empowers citizens to be more to access information timely and to be more informed about their energy choices. But also the community energy models, which of course again cannot solve the whole crisis, but still give more power to people to make their choices. And in some specific local context, the community energy models or projects prove to be successful and provide less expensive access to energy.
Thank you. Can I bring in Brenda? I think she had a hand up. If you could give microphone access to Brenda, that'd be great. Brenda?
Yes, thank you. Well, I was very interested in something that Sabrina said about putting low-income households on green electricity, which is something I've been thinking about because it takes them off the fossil fuels and the prices. But that's a very long-term situation. I mean, it's certainly more than 6 months. And I think it's a good opportunity, but I have, in effect, one statement, one question. My statement is we cannot do anything like enough without a windfall tax. We've just got to get some money out of the utilities to give to, whether it's advice agencies, one-stop shops, whatever it is, we've got to do something much more dramatic in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. So that was the first thing. One of the questions I also had was particularly linked to getting the poorest people off gas and therefore more people into electricity and solely electricity. And therefore the extent to which people on this call would support a programme to get heat pumps into social housing. Now, the reason I think that's a good idea is because they're very easy to find. And we've had approaches through social landlords before, which have worked very well. The reason I'm worried about it is because an awful lot of the people in social housing are not, with the new definition, in fuel poverty because they're already in an A, B or C property. So it would be an easy policy, but it wouldn't get to the most vulnerable. So that's my question to anybody else.
So anybody would like to answer that? I'm not sure if we have
maybe I would start, so then Anna and Peter can continue. So about the windfall tax, about your statement on windfall tax, yes, we do agree that as part of the immediate action, the windfall tax, for example, on the extortionate fossil fuel profit from the recently inflated prices should be considered. This would probably encourage more responsibility on the side of fossil fuel corporation, and also would probably acknowledge the social contribution to the cost coming from this industry. Of course, when we do consider the windfall tax, I think it's important also to avoid any disproportionate damage on the investment in renewables. About heat pumps, this is an excellent point. We do at EU level and in the Right to Energy Coalition, in which FPRN is one of the co-founding members, we do advocate for the use of heat pumps in all houses and including social housing. But I think your question was, would this be accepted? That's a very good question. I think, again, if we do, in a way, imagine to design a better system, so if we do have a more integrated approach at national and local level, I think that the heat pumps in social housing could also be implemented, but this should be part of a more integrated strategy.
Thank you. I mean, the key issue I think a lot of people emphasize is the importance of providing good insulation alongside heat pumps, because putting a heat pump in a leaky home is a recipe for disaster in terms of fuel price rises. I just wonder if we can move on. And I think there's a question about standing charges, because there's been a massive increase in standing charges, you know, in terms of the way the price cap is calculated and so on. I think there is some variation between fuel companies in the extent to which they use that standing charge. So, you know, any thoughts about, you know, how, you know, that particular issue might be tackled?
So I'm just trying to find the question.
Well, I'll read it out. It's actually, you know, about how the fuel board might self-disconnect by not consuming. But however, as the standing charge increases, does that become even more unaffordable? But I think I'm aware that, you know, this is a particular aspect of the way the price cap is calculated, and that you know, the extent to which it's now the standing charge accounts for a substantial portion of that.
Yeah, it is. It's tricky because that's something that you then cannot mitigate against by reducing how much you're using. I think there's other issues as well to think about when we're looking at disproportionate impacts of low-income households and things like using electricity meters, and there you find people are actually paying more per unit, and it tends to be the sort of poorest people. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be sorted out that are issues in the way that we pay for our energy, and particularly how the least able to pay are paying.
And in fact, yeah, the price cap goes up, is even higher for prepayment meter consumers. We used to have a separate price cap to the overall default price cap, which try to address the particular issues. Peter, did you want to comment on this?
Only that, in theory, hopefully, if the prices do come down, the cap can be a cap again. So I suppose, you know, in the way that sort of the, you know, the markets, the transferring switching suppliers should actually become a thing again. I suppose that's something that's we might have to keep an eye out for. And I suppose other than that, that was my main thought. But I think the other thing is sort of, yeah, to keep an eye on what the standing charges components are, because quite a lot of the standing charge increase has been sort of the bailouts for sort of companies that have failed as well. So how does that kind of evolve over time? Is there kind of do you eventually pay it off or anything, or is it stuck forever? But yeah, to look at.
I think I've seen something like £100. It's costing all of us £100 to bail out and bulb energy is effectively sort of almost been nationalized, you know, because it's too big to fail. You know, I think we've heard that story before. There's a question here. This is a really tricky one, but I don't know who might feel brave enough to tackle it. But what do people see as the future of gas prices 10 to 20 years hence from now? What prediction do people set store by? You know, would politics intervene at some point, even through carbon taxes? Stranded asset costs would logically put gas prices upwards. I think this is essentially, you know, as we move from gas to electricity, what happens to those still on gas, and the implications of gas prices in the long term, as for those who still will be reliant on gas fuel. Anybody want to have a go at that?
It's so difficult. So we've been doing modelling. That chart I provided, sort of the 2023-24. That line shrinks and grows. By sort of month as so. I think it's really difficult to go long term, particularly with and short term is going to be so volatile. But hopefully, energy experts in the room will be able to sort of be a better answer than me.
So here's a more straightforward one. Top 3 policy asks to address fuel poverty. 3 brief things you would like to see happen. I'll ask each of you for that. Anne, would you like to have a go first?
Okay, I haven't quite got 3, but I think there's a real need to get better data about how people are using energy in the home, because I think we're probably quite reliant on historical data, and everything's changed. The rise of electric cars, the rise of home working. I don't think we fully understand this new normal. And I think that's going to have implications as to the sorts of people who could potentially move into fuel poverty. So I would strongly advocate for the collection of good and robust evidence. I mean, it's just crazy when you're looking at how the government was going to help people with the rise in fuel bills by looking at council tax payments. I mean, that bears no resemblance to your energy use whatsoever. So more data, better data. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. More research needed. It sounds like the classic researcher's answer.
More work for me.
Peter, would you like to have a go?
Yeah, so I think before the next, when probably around the time of the next energy cap announcement, I do think there needs to be a new kind of policy. And Anne's right, sort of council tax bans are so kind of spread out that you can't actually mitigate much of the rise for a kind of sensible cost, because you're giving it to 80% of the population. So something more targeted at that point we think is absolutely necessary. I do sort of almost putting my very old hat on, that there has to be sort of a major kind of program on the housing side. I think, just because kind of incentivizing doing this and the other, it's just a bit too bitty and to actually get to where you need to get to, personally thinking. And then my third one would be just upright benefits by actual inflation next week, which can be done, we can see from universal credit, but unfortunately almost is impossible, will not happen for the politics, unfortunately. But those are my 3.
So that's referring to benefits are going to be uprated at 3% rather than the 6% or even 9% that low income households. Do you have a view on whether there should be because it's based on CPI, isn't it? And I think there's been a lot of argument that that's not appropriate for low income, that the inflation rate in low income households face is even higher than the CPI. Is that something Joseph Roundtree's looked at?
So we have had a look at it. I think basically this is another sort of Anne's point about the data needs to be better. So there's lots of evidence that it could be higher, but there's a big program by ONS to actually work out whether it is higher. I think for now, you've got an inflation rate and it's not even keeping up with that. So yeah, I think at a minimum CPI, but then if ONS work out a better inflation rate, then that might be the one to use. But for now, I think it's just making sure people don't see a massive real terms cut in their income from April.
And Sabrina, would you like to, have you got 3 key asks?
I think we do have a lot of wishes, maybe more than predictions in the after the war in Ukraine. But I think that, we would like to see more electricity coming from renewables rather than fossil fuel. As mentioned before, it's for us is also crucial to have a fair energy pricing. And then I would say that providing more transparency in the energy pricing is very important for citizens, including, for example, the profit margin of wholesalers, retail suppliers, the grid, the billing. So giving people access to information and control of their energy supply and consumption. But again, as said, this measure should be harmonized in the existing structural demands and also address the root causes of energy poverty. And yeah, another reflection I had is also about the climate change and the impact of climate change on the southern countries, which proved to be heavier than the northern countries of the world. So I think any measure for social justice that provide relief for people in Europe should also not come to the expense or to the detriment of people living in the global south who are suffering from a harder impact of the climate change.
Thank you. So I think I've seen a bit of debate around hydrogen, which is a pretty hot topic at the moment. There's a suggestion: would it help, because of this potential problem of stranded assets and gas becoming even more expensive as we transition to electricity? Would the solution be to provide grants for people to replace their gas boilers with hydrogen-ready boilers, so that they can, we have hybrid, in effect, provide hybrid boilers. So I think that, that requires you to take perspective on what you think the potential is for hydrogen for domestic heating and the likely trajectory of hydrogen prices. Anybody want to have a go at that? Sabrina, is that something that's been looked at?
Yeah, I was thinking, actually, yeah, this is part of this year research. I don't have fresh data to share, but is on our to-do list as part of the options to phase out fossil fuels. But I don't have recent data to share on the potential of hydrogen yet.
So do you think there is a potential for hydrogen to be a viable fuel,
there might be a potential in the context of a diversified energy supply. So for sure, the full phasing out of the fossil fuel will not happen in a couple of years. So we need to prepare a scenario where we do have a better diversified energy sources.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're drawing to a close. Thank you to all the speakers. Would anybody like to make some concluding remarks before we close the webinar? Well, and I am not sure, I don't think we've got any more questions in the comment. Thank you, all the speakers. I think it's been really interesting presentations. Thank you for your time and the effort you put into speaking to us, and thank you to all the participants. As I say, there will be, I think it's been mentioned, we will make the slides available, and we'll try and produce a short write-up of this webinar. And yes, the plan is the FPRN, this is the first of a series of webinars we're hoping to hold over the next year. We might even go back to an in-person conference at some point in the future, but that's still probably a little way off yet. Thank you again, and hope to see everybody soon.
Thank you. Bye.